Hey, sixth graders, this is your science teachers. We're here to talk about LS2.1 and LS2.3, energy's impact in an ecosystem. Our two standards that we're looking at is LS2.1, evaluate and communicate the impact of environmental variables on population size, and LS2.3, draw conclusions about the transfer of energy through a food web and energy pyramid in an ecosystem.
There are 6 levels to environmental organizations. You have the individual or the organism, which is just one living thing. You have population, which is a group. You have community, which is all of the living things in an ecosystem. Then you have ecosystem and biome and biosphere. Let's take a closer look. Biosphere. This is the region on the surface of the earth. It includes the atmosphere and bodies of waters where living organisms live. So this is everything that's around you is a biosphere. A biome is a formation of plants and animals that have common characteristics due to similar climates and can be found over a range of continents. So if we're looking at the picture, you can see that the oceans are one type of biome, and you can see that there are tropical forests and temperate forests and mountainous areas and greenlands and deserts and polar regions. All these regions are different types of biomes based on their characteristics and what they're able to provide. An ecosystem is a community of living organisms that includes producers, consumers, and decomposers, biotic and abiotic components. So producers and consumers and decomposers all are things that eat or live. Biotic is living organisms, and abiotic is not living or never had lived factors. And then you have a community. These are many different types of populations that live in one area, and they live cohesively together and compete for the different types of resources. And then you have a population. Populations are just one group of animal living in that area. So it could be humans, it could be a group of rabbits, a group of deer. They're just one type of animal that reproduces and lives together. And lastly, you have your individual, and these are one living thing or organisms.
In an ecosystem, organisms can be grouped by how they get energy. They're going to be grouped either as producers, consumers, or decomposers. So let's look at producers first. Producers actually produce their own food. That's how they get their name. All the energy in an ecosystem comes through sunlight. So that's where it all starts. The sun's energy comes to the ecosystem, and producers change that light energy into a chemical energy, which is food. These are typically plants, but they can be algae and bacteria. Some corals are photosynthetic. Phytoplankton are photosynthetic. And that just means that they use that process called photosynthesis to turn light energy into food. They produce. The next category is consumers. Consumers can't make their own food, so they have to eat other organisms. They feed directly on producers or other consumers. Consumers eat. The next group is a decomposer. Decomposers don't eat. They break down dead organisms. They break apart the chemical bonds and they take the energy that way. Decomposers are super important in our ecosystems because they take those nutrients and that energy and they put it back in the soil so that it can be absorbed by plants and other organisms, and we start the energy cycle again. A food chain is a straight line. It's like things linked together in a chain, and it shows the transfer of energy from one organism to another. So we always start with producers. They're the organisms that bring energy into the ecosystem. So producers are eaten by consumers, who are then eaten by larger consumers, who are then eaten by even larger consumers. A very important thing about a food chain and even a food web is that the arrow points in the direction that the energy is flowing. So if you'll look at the picture, the flower has an arrow pointing to the caterpillar. The caterpillar is getting its energy from the flower. The arrow from the caterpillar points to the frog. That means the frog gets its energy from the caterpillar. The frog's arrow points to the snake. That means the snake gets its energy from the frog. And the last arrow is from the snake to the owl, and that means the owl gets the energy from the snake.
All right, so now we're going to look at trophic levels. With a trophic level, sort of think of it like a pyramid, and we'll look at that in just a second. But at that bottom level, we have our producers. They produce the energy that is flowing through that ecosystem. Next, we have a primary consumer. The primary consumer is basically the first thing to eat. Usually those are herbivores, but sometimes they can be omnivores. The primary consumer is the first one to eat. Remember, primary means first. Then we have our secondary consumer. We've got a little picture of a mouse here. Our secondary consumers can be omnivores or carnivores. Then we have our tertiary. Tertiary is just another way of saying it's the third thing to eat. And they can be omnivores or carnivores. And then finally we have the quaternary consumer. Those are the fourth thing to eat. We usually consider those animals to be the top of the food chain. They're the apex predator, that nothing really eats those. Now notice in this image we have decomposers over here on the left hand side. That's because decomposers don't really care what level of consumer you are. They're going to eat you anyway and break down your minerals back into the soil that the producer will use to grow. All right, so remember that pyramid I was talking about? Here we have that image on the left-hand side. We have our plants at the base. They're at the base because they are the largest amount in an ecosystem. There's a ton of producers everywhere. Then we go up to our primary consumers. Those can be herbivores, sometimes omnivores. There's a lot of those, but notice the pyramid's getting smaller. So the number of organisms are also getting smaller because of the energy that's being passed on is getting less and less and less. So if there's not enough energy, there's not going to be a ton of that organism around. Then we have our secondary consumers here. Notice again that area is getting smaller as we go up the pyramid. The amount of energy is decreasing as we go up the pyramid, and the number of organisms will be decreasing as we go up the pyramid. Then we have our tertiary consumers up here at the top, even smaller number of organisms and an even smaller amount of energy. So this tertiary consumer here, they have to eat a lot in order to survive because they're getting so little energy from what they're consuming. We also have food webs. Food webs also show our trophic levels. We have our herbivores down here on top of our producers, secondary consumers, and then our tertiary consumers. Remember, a food web is different from a food chain because it's showing the energy flow in all directions in an ecosystem, not just one straight line from one organism to another. Okay, here's another image of an energy pyramid, and I really like this one because it's showing you the amount of energy that is being passed on. So we have our producers here, we have our primary consumers. Remember, those are the first guys to eat. They're getting 10% of that energy from eating a producer, so they've got to eat a lot in order to feel full. But the secondary consumer, they're only getting 1% of energy. And then that third level, that's the tertiary level consumer. They're only getting 1/10 of an energy. And then that apex predator or quaternary consumer, they are getting 1/100th. Our decomposers here on the left, they're getting energy from every level. They're breaking down that material back into the soil for our primary producers. All right, so something to keep in the back of your mind as we work through our entire year this year is law of conservation of energy. Most of the things that we'll be talking about this year have to do with energy, so this applies to everything that we'll be learning. The law of conservation of energy states that energy cannot be created or destroyed, it just changes form and transfers. So when we look at food chains, food webs, and the energy flow in an ecosystem, we have to think about the energy that's being passed on. So think back to that energy pyramid and how producers are at the base of that pyramid. They've got 100% of the energy, they're creating it themselves. But when they get eaten, only 10% is passed on. So that other 90%, the plants, the producers are using, and then some of that is also being released as heat energy. And we're going to see that release of heat energy every time we go up that energy pyramid. So from like producers to primary consumers to secondary consumers, because they have to have energy to live and run and eat, and so they're using that energy up, and that's why when they get eaten, only a certain amount of energy is being passed on.
All right, limiting factors, also known as environmental variables. Limiting factors are resources that are scarce, and it can limit the size of a population. So if you don't have enough water, that can be a limiting factor. If there's not enough food someplace, there's a limiting factor. Making sure there's enough shelter or sunlight for something is a limiting factor that can limit the size of a population. Carrying capacity is the largest population that an environment can support. So maybe if the population is growing, it can only hit a certain point before it runs out of food or water or shelter for that population, and they will level out at a certain point. This is a carrying capacity graph. Okay, you can see that the growth rate of the population is increasing, and then as you start to reach that carrying capacity, the population decreases and starts to level out. The carrying capacity is where this levels out, right here at the top. This is where you've run out of food, there's not enough water, there's not enough space for the population to continue to grow. Yes, also you need to make sure that you have watched the video on Canvas that talks about how to read charts and graphs, because there are lots of graphs in this unit, and you need to make sure that you're understanding so that you can ask questions if you need to. Alright guys, that is your teacher video for LS 2.1 and 2.3, and